I'm Lesley Riddoch. I'm a journalist, a columnist for The National and an independent supporter. And I'm chuffed to be interviewing the three leaders of the pro-independence parties in this general election. The aim is to try and help yesers essentially make up their mind. Although if you're a no voter watching this, come on in, the water's lovely. And I'm not trying to ask patsy questions. We've had those and you wouldn't expect anything else. It's not personal. And many of the questions have actually been supplied by national readers. So I'm really pleased to say that we have with us Stephen Flynn, who is the SNP Westminster leader and an MP. Hello, Stephen.
Hi, Lesley. How are you?
Well, not as overheating as you by the looks of it, but then you are in London. And as befits, the only one of the leaders who actually has something personal at stake in this election, as in your own seat. It looks as if Labour's going to win. What does that mean for Scotland?
Yeah, so if I can just start, I guess in terms of my own seat, I've always looked at politics from a slightly different perspective, that the seats belong to the public, they don't belong to the politicians, and all we're seeking to do is gain their trust and occupy that role for as long as they'd like us to do so. And hopefully, certainly in my neck of the woods, people will show faith in me as they did back in 2019. When it comes to the wider election, yeah, look, I don't think anyone would suggest that anything other than a Labour victory at Westminster. Keir Starmer is going to be the Prime Minister, and that affords people in Scotland the opportunity to reflect. Everyone wants to get rid of the Tories, but that job's done. It's complete. They are going to lose. So who do they want to send down to Westminster? Do they want to send people who will do Keir Starmer's work in Scotland, or do they want people who will do Scotland's work in Westminster and make sure that Scotland's voice is heard loudly and clearly? And in the SNP, they know that will be the case. And we've got so many examples of that over recent times, whether that's Joanna Cherry and her efforts, justified efforts, to ensure that Boris Johnson couldn't prorogue Parliament illegally, whether that's Marion Fellows with the Horizon scandal, whether that's Gavin Newlands with the free-to-air Scotland football games, whether that's Alison Thula's campaigning against the two-child benefit cap. We've got a clear record of delivery on the biggest issues and making sure that Scotland's interests are heard. And I've got absolute confidence that should we be returned to Westminster, that will be the case. And of course, that enables us to keep that fire burning brightly for that independent future that we all want to see as soon as possible.
Let me ask you about that, because we've got a question from Robert Doig, who's saying, why shouldn't the SNP follow Sinn Féin and just not attend Westminster and have an anti-Westminster pact and so on? I mean, you're talking about holding the Westminster government to account, and indeed your own contribution on Gaza could have been in your list. But let's be really honest, can you? You first past the post will give them a massive majority. Their own backbenchers won't have any influence over them at all. So can you seriously say that you are holding anybody's feet to the fire?
Yes, absolutely. And, I guess it kind of goes back to the initial question about, well, why do we go and why do we not abstain like the folk from Sinn Féin do? And it's because if we're not there speaking up for Scotland, then nobody's going to be there speaking up for Scotland. And the unionists.
For a minute, you were going to say then we would have really difficult things in Scotland as a result of it. And we are having it anyway. I mean, it's great that you're speaking up, but I think people at the stage of just speaking up, it's impressive, but it actually doesn't feel like it's enough.
But that's the role of a parliamentary democracy, is to make sure that your voice is heard. And if we weren't there fighting that corner for Scotland, nobody would be. And within that context, the unionist parties, the Labour Party, Conservatives, Lib Dems, and whomever else is elected would love nothing more than not having to think about the SNP. And let's be very blunt about this in the Westminster context. If the SNP are not there talking about Scotland, nobody will be. And when nobody is talking about Scotland, they'll think that it's a distant issue and that independence is not something that's on the horizon. 50% of Scots want an independent Scotland. And the only way that can be distilled through the parliamentary system we have is to make sure that SNP politicians are there doing so. And that's been the same if we go back to the days of Winnie Ewing or the days of Alex Salmond or the days of Angus Robertson, or the days before I became a parliamentarian in 2019. We can provide that voice, and we will continue to provide that voice. And the notion that if you step aside, Westminster will then give you what you want is for the birds. And frankly, if that was the simple solution to all of this, then I think that the aforementioned politicians, the very well experienced and well versed aforementioned politicians who I've mentioned there, would have taken that easy option. They didn't, because they know that democracy is a prize to, it's not a prize, it's something to be cherished. And ultimately, within the democracy that we operate within, we need to be that voice for Scotland.
So
and that's why we go, and that's why we'll continue to make sure that our voice is heard.
But that does kind of mean we're snookered then, doesn't it? I mean, Keir Starmer has so recently said no Indie-Ref negotiations, whatever the election result. I mean, he's basically kicking sand in your face.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect Keir Starmer, as the guy who wants to be a leader of the UK, to say anything else right now. But that's for the Scottish public to reflect on and to determine how they want to vote. And you know what frustrates me a wee bit, Lesley, is this question kind of gets pinned on us by the media as if it's the SNP that is the problem in this, because we want something to happen, when in actual fact it's those people who deny Scotland's democracy and who say that the views of the people of Scotland don't matter irrespective of how they vote, who are the problem. And that's where we need to use that as a compelling narrative to take to the doors right across the country and say to people, this is what the Labour Party stand for. They don't. Yeah. They're not worried about what you say and what you believe in, and that's a way to fight an election, and that's what we are doing and will continue to do.
I've got to say that the questions that came in, most from the readers of the National, are nearly all for you, and they're all about independent strategy. So it's not just that it's kind of, the mainstream media and unionist opponents that are throwing this one at you. I mean, Barbara Nair, for example, says, what are the next steps? If there's no Section 30 coming, what's the plan?
Yeah, and so firstly, what we need to do is make sure that we return as many SNP MPs as we possibly can at the election. I think all of us know that it's all to play for in big parts of Scotland, and we need to make sure that our argument's compelling. We've got 9-10 days to do that. Some people, of course, will have already voted. So point one is to make sure that we have as many SNP MPs returned as possible. And then, of course, we need to assess the options on the back of that. We believe that if we get a majority of seats in Westminster, that should enable us to enter negotiations on that basis. And our manifesto is obviously quite clear about the transfer of powers, because this is one of the issues, that Westminster has the power rather than Holyrood has the power, the transfer of that power to Holyrood so that we can take things forward. Now, if you run the course of that argument on the basis that the SNP does win a majority of seats and Keir Starmer then says no, a Scottish Parliament election is very much on the horizon, and it'll be for the SNP to determine as a collective what it is that we seek to do next. I would be pretty confident in my mind that if we do win a majority and the United Kingdom Prime Minister, or Labour United Kingdom Prime Minister, says no and ignores the view of the people of Scotland, that's quite a compelling argument to take into the 2026 election. But ultimately, whilst all that's happening,
as a de facto referendum, I mean, would that then be the vote that is essentially the referendum you're not allowed?
Well, I wouldn't want to prejudge what the SNP conference and SNP membership would want to take forward. Obviously, at our conference where we determined our position, the 2026 election was certainly something which was looked at and discussed as part of the motion, which was ultimately agreed. But it'll be for the membership of the party to take that forward. My priority right now is...
I mean, you're pretty influential in the whole thing. Have you seriously not got a view? Because it was actually pretty implicit in quite a lot of the debate. I was there. The policy.
I was there as well, and I backed the motion which went through, and that's the basis from which we start. The party, of course, has a new leader, a new leadership team in Edinburgh, and the way that Parliament works and the way that politics works is that things change. But I would like to think that we'd be in a position where we have a very, very strong hand to play in the run up to that 2026 election. But the priority right now...
But you do just keep saying these things, right? You say, so you've got a new leader, so things do change. Well, see, like the way I hear that is you had this position that was fundamentally we're moving to de facto referendum for Holyrood, and things have changed because John Swinney's not up for it.
No, that's definitely not what I'm saying, Lesley. All I'm saying
Clearing
is
it
that
up.
no. All I'm saying is that we need to be in a position where we make sure that we properly include our membership, and the new leader's in a position to express his view to the membership. I would assume that John's in agreement with me in relation to the motion that was agreed by conference as it was, and I would like to certainly take it forward. But the point I was trying to make was, whilst that parliamentary machinations are all undertaken over the course of the next 10 days and beyond, we need to make sure that we're actually winning the argument here. And we're still 50-50 in the polls, and that's not good enough. We need to be doing better. We need to convince people that independence is the right way forward, and we need to do that in big numbers. I actually think a Labour government's going to help in that regard, because the change that people might be expecting isn't going to come. We know what Rachel Reeves stands for. We know that she believes in the continuation of austerity, massive public sector cuts, has the same fiscal rules as the Tories. I think it was a former governor at the Bank of England who said there's a lettuce leaf between that's a certain irony there in the use of lettuce, but there's a lettuce leaf there between the Labour and the Tory fiscal rules. We know that Brexit, we're not going to see any movement on single market, on customs union, on freedom of movement. And we know that on the cost of living, there's not going to be anything substantial put on the table in terms of energy bill, mortgage payments, or food bills.
So, Stephen,
that's quite. So as we build up to that 2026 election, with the party position being what it is, with a Labour government not delivering, I think that's quite a compelling narrative for us to grow support for independence.
But you've rehearsed those arguments. John Swinney has rehearsed them on endless debates. Why would independent supporters in Scotland be voting Labour still?
People want rid of the Tories. I think that's a pretty
They'll be getting rid of you. I mean, in lots of the Labour seats, they're in Glasgow. It's you they'll be getting rid of.
Yeah, but Lesley, you know as well as I do that we're not going to form the government in Westminster, and people are understandably of the view that they want rid of the Tories after 14 years of complete economic disaster and social catastrophe in terms of what they did with Brexit. And I understand that, and I get that, and that's why now, where we are, when we have that certainty that the Tories are gone and we have so many seats in the mix as to whether it's going to be SNP or Labour, I think it's for folk back at home to reflect on who is best placed to represent them in Westminster and stands by the values that they have, which is obviously that ultimate belief in Scotland becoming an independent nation. And I think in that context, we can surprise a fair few of our doubters in 9-10 days' time.
When you talk about independence, a lot of the time it's framed as keeping control in Scotland. I was actually at a meeting where one of the strategists explained that goes down very well with people, in a way that independence still seems to scare the horses. But I mean, that's being picked up by quite a few commentators, that you're just not putting the word independence in when people feel that they would love to hear you say it.
Yeah, it's so I get criticised for not talking about independence enough, and then on the flip side of the coin, I get criticised for talking about independence too much. I'm not sure how I win in that context. Look, I've believed and fought for independence my entire adult life. I traipsed around the streets of Aberdeen on a crutch, chapping doors up and down tenements, trying to convince people that independence was the right route forward for our country. And I went in a hell of a strop when the result was coming in at the counting hall in Aberdeen on that day. And my passion for that independent Scotland hasn't ebbed at all. I know that people understand what the SNP stand for. They know that the SNP believes in Scotland becoming an independent country. I think the electorate in Scotland are very well versed in our policies and our principles. And as we are approaching this general election, a lot of stuff that I had been talking about in terms of austerity, in terms of Brexit, in terms of the cost of living, it is all deeply intertwined with the need for independence, as John has rightly set out. And you have to be in a position when you're engaging with the public to meet them where they are with their priorities, and also with your vision as well. And that's what we're trying to seek to do in an election where ultimately the big defining thing is, of course, to get rid of the Conservatives. And that makes it a little bit more challenging for us in a Westminster election context. But that's why we've got to rise to that challenge and meet the public where they are.
which all makes perfect sense, except that in the past you did it. In the past, the SNP broke the bank, did all sorts of electoral things that didn't seem possible. And it just feels a little bit now that with Nicola Sturgeon's resignation, all the problems that have happened with the court case, the change of leadership, all of that, it feels as if you said that your energy for independence hasn't ebbed, but it seems as if the confidence of voters in the SNP to deliver something in our lifetimes, God, I cannot tell you how many times people say to me now, I'm not going to see it. And that's changed. Do you accept that?
So, to start with the start of your question there, if we look back to like the 2010 general election, when the SNP were in government, we were on the brink, of course, just a year later of breaking the electoral system in Holyrood and winning a majority. Not a single seat changed hands in Scotland. The SNP did not win big in the general election context because the Scottish public understand what a Westminster election stands for and what it's about. It was, of course, from 2015 onwards when we've had the big victories. Even in 2017, we still won a remarkable number of MPs in comparison with the party's history. So I think we need to look at these things in the round when it comes to the general election context. With regards to
a narc, but there's one way it's going, and the support, all the projections in MRP polls are you'll have 8 seats, 18 seats, 20 seats that you might lose essentially the Scottish election.
So the polls that I've seen over the course of the last week or two have had us anywhere between 11 and 37 seats, and I think that's a reflection of the fact that in the minds of so many back home, they want rid of the Tories, and they're now determining who's best to represent them at Westminster. And this election is somewhat unique in that context because, as I say, there is that burning desire to get rid of the Tories, but also that desire amongst 50% of the population for Scotland to become an independent nation. There's only one party politically who can be the vehicle to deliver that. And that juxtaposition is something that folk are getting their heads around. And from that regard, they're obviously undecided as to where to put their X at this moment in time. And we've got a very short time frame within which to convince them, but it is very much up in the air in huge parts of Scotland, particularly right across the central belt. But we're fighting for every vote because it's important to get to where we want to be as an independent nation, that we do continue to win elections and win elections well. And I guess to go back to your question with regards to folk who say that it won't come in my lifetime, many of the people around me up in Aberdeen who are some of the most ardent campaigners for the party and for an independent Scotland are those who would perhaps be significantly older than I am. But our enthusiasm is the same, our desire is the same, and we're working hard to make sure that it does happen in their lifetime, and it happens sooner rather than later, because that benefits us all.
Right. Domestic politics. I mean, this is a kind of weird election in that it is a Westminster election that seems to be being fought on lots of kind of Holyrood grounds. I've got to say, there's a feeling that the SNP offer within Holyrood does look kind of tired. And, the questions are chucked at you all the time about delivery on the health service. I don't really want to get into, what we all now understand to be the responses to that. But, I mean, do you kind of accept that people feel you've just been in for a long time and it kind of just feels all a bit tired now in Holyrood?
No, I don't. And to the commentators or people who feel like that, I would just simply say to them to look at what's just gone through in the last Scottish budget with a decision in relation to tax, which has obviously caused a bit of controversy at the time, but it's an extra £1.5 billion in total Scottish Government's raising to support public services. That's progressive taxation in action, 100,000 kids being lifted out of poverty, the continuation of policies in Scotland which don't exist anywhere else on these isles.
What's the SNP's new big idea? Because, I mean, fair enough, and the continuation of these things is certainly something that needs to be emphasised, but it feels like there's no big new idea coming.
It's obviously, Lesley, It's not for me to, to outline what the Scottish Government should or shouldn't be doing. I'm fighting an election for the Westminster Parliament. But when I look at the record of my colleagues in Edinburgh and their delivery upon that, I've got a great sense of pride in that. And I think they're doing a brilliant job for Scotland. And whether it's the health service or education or transport, I'm quite happy to talk about all these issues because of our record in government. And, you know, John Swinney's only just got his feet under the table in Butte House, but I've got no doubt in the weeks and months to come, he'll be coming forward with his vision. But as we talk about that, we can't forget the fact that it would be very easy for me to sit here, or for John or anyone else to sit here and say we want to do these massive things right across Scotland, when we know that our budget's being cut, when we know that our capital budget, which allows us to build new roads and new schools and new hospitals, is being cut by 9% and eroded by inflation, like everything else in society.
But there's stories, the stories fly around then, like, there's a kind of underspend and kind of capital underspend of 130 million pounds this year. At the same time,
what's that like? Is it zero?
200 million.
That's
not the same as the European money argument, which is still lurking around as well. It just feels like that.
I used to be the audit convener for a local authority when I was a councillor, and there's pretty much always underspends, very, very small underspends as a percentage of the totality of a budget. I would need to go and reacquaint myself with the figures, but I think the numbers that are being referred to there by yourself are point something of a percent of the totality of the Scottish budget. And of course, when projects are delivered, the timelines change for them as delivery happens and as people are available and as projects are acted upon, and that can fall into different financial years. The sum of money that we're talking about there, when we look at the entire quantum of the Scottish budget, is tiny. And I don't think that should be used as an opportunity to say that something could or should be happening differently. And I would imagine, and you'll forgive me because I've not actually looked at the actuality of the spend, but I would imagine that some of that spend is probably already allocated into projects for the coming financial year, because that's what tends to happen with budgets that roll over. It doesn't just stop at the end of the year. There's space available, they go forward. But we are working within a financial constraints, which are, from speaking with my colleagues in Edinburgh, like nothing they've seen before. And in that regard, all roads do lead to Westminster and austerity and Brexit and the damage that's just been done to our economy by a parliament that we don't support and within whose policies we don't back.
Sure. But I mean, I think some people would nonetheless like to see a bit of kind of robustness, even if it's pushing the envelope and challenging where those the divvy up of powers lie. So, for example, ALBA and the Labour Party have obviously got GB Energy. We could again have a discussion about what it actually means. But still, there was a proposal at SNP conference that there would be a national energy company set up in Scotland. And why didn't it happen?
So, firstly, with GB Energy, I mean, I've got no idea what it is still. And being up in Aberdeen, you would think I might have an inclination from speaking with folk in industry, but they don't know what it is either, because it won't sell or produce energy. And it appears to be just an investment vehicle into the private sector, which is kind of what the civil service already does out of Whitehall. So it's all moderately confusing, and I'm not entirely sure why we should be grateful that it's simply going to be housed in Scotland when it's all our resources, which of course flow the opposite way. When it comes to the retail offering, which I think Nicola announced back in 2016 or 2017, I'll hold my hands up. I'm actually quite moderately glad that the retail company was not set up, because within a couple of years we had a energy price shock, which would have quite possibly bankrupted that retail arm within a matter of minutes, because every single person in Scotland would have jumped on to the government-funded energy scheme. And of course, as you know, the Scottish Government budget operates on finite resource. Now, I remember, again, being a local authority councillor, and there's an energy from waste plant that was being built in Aberdeen. And the talk was about whether we could set up a social tariff on the back of it. And I remember attending a whole host of meetings, and we had a number of advisors come in external advisors to look at that, and ultimately the money that was required to deliver it meant that there was no reasonable grounds for an organisation which has effective borrowing constraints to be able to do so. I don't know the ins and outs of what the Scottish Government looked at, but based upon what we've seen of the market and the collapse of some of the big energy giants over people's bills just over the course of the last couple of years because of the fact they went through the roof, I'm not sure the Scottish Government would even have been in a position to sustain the losses that would have been accrued overnight as a result of what Putin did in Ukraine. And if I'm honest, Lesley, I don't actually think we should just be talking about a retail arm that sells energy. I think we should be looking to do things much bigger than that and taking a public stake in some of these big renewables projects. Of course, we can't do that under the constraints of devolution. Well,
where's not have obtained a share in ScotWind because that went cheap.
So of course the capital investment required to do that and to work in partnership with the private sector is enormous, and the constraints put upon budget, as I've already outlined, to deliver hospitals, to deliver schools, and to deliver roads infrastructure is already enormous by the fact it's been cut. But that's the future that we should be aiming for, and that's what we should be trying to achieve. Whether that's a 5% stake, a 10% stake, whether that's not the projects themselves but the surrounding infrastructure, because it's the surrounding infrastructure which is ultimately the key to the ability of these projects to be delivered, be that through pipelines or be that through the grid. That's where government should have a role to play. And energy, as it stands, as you know, is a reserved matter for Westminster. So if we are to spend money in that field, then that needs to come from resources which would otherwise be allocated to things that are under the devolved competencies of the Scottish Government. So we need to be realistic as well as have a vision.
I get that, and yet, I mean, I was in Shetland recently and Orkney. People are tearing their hair out to see so much renewable investment going on around them, and diddly squat coming their way. And we've got a question from Claire Harris, who's also pointing out a community project at Garnock Valley. They're surrounded by wind turbines that give no benefit to the community at all, and the one community-owned turbine they have will generate 12 million over its lifetime, which is like a city deal worth of investment. So, I mean, are you just saying there's nothing that you can essentially do about that? You're stuck.
So I would like to think that we can get into a position where there is proper benefits for consumers and for communities for the project, because the scale of some of the stuff that's coming down the line, particularly through Scotland, or even some of the future onshore wind developments, or Corrie Glass or Cruachan, when we look at hydro-pump storage, or we look at the potential for the green hydrogen economy, it's massive. And when you're a nation which is blessed with natural resources, then you need to be making sure that the benefits felt by the population. That's not been the case.
Anything you can do about that? Because I mean, at the moment, basically, we can say, hey, it's great. We've got the highest levels of inward investment anywhere outside the Southeast. Mm-hmm. No blooming wonder, because any company can come here and fundamentally raid our renewables with nothing that the Scottish Government or the SNP can do about it.
Well, it'd be very difficult for us to do anything within the confines of the situation as we face it.
Why not use planning in a crafty way? I mean, Alex Salmond used planning, despite the fact that energy is reserved to Westminster, to push through all the wind developments that's seen Scotland become a leader in that. You could make sort of planning contingent on using more domestic labour within contracts. That's normal in other countries.
I mean, of course, there's things that you can look at when it comes to the planning system, and when I would probably push back just a wee bit, because I'm aware of some fairly sizable developments that are directly related to renewables projects, whether that's onshore wind or whether that's grid infrastructure, where planning is going to potentially provide communities with what they believe is the support that they require as well. So there is a middle ground that has to be found within all of this. I think in an ideal world, we would love to see a situation where we had and were able to drive up the level of domestic content within a lot of these projects, because quite frankly, up till now, it's not been good enough.
You could just refuse planning.
So are we suggesting that we would just not have any projects taking forward?
You think you would get a bit of a negotiation going, wouldn't you? Because clearly it's such a good resource. It just feels like, there's no constraints being placed on in any kind of way at all. But still, look, let's move on. I want to ask you one other
Okay, of
question
course.
before our time's up. Oil and gas, obviously there's been huge discussions about this. And then there was a Supreme Court verdict last week that said about a drilling operation in Surrey that it couldn't go ahead because from here on in, when you calculate the impact on the environment, you have to take in the whole life cycle of what you're going to take out of the earth, namely the oil being burnt. Does that not knock Cambo, Rosebank, and all the rest of it, and your, individual assessments of each project into a cocked hat?
So that actually reminds me, firstly, of a quote. I remember David Duckett getting interviewed by GMS. I think it was about Cambo or Rosemount, and he was asked about taking it out of the ground, and he said, "Oh, it doesn't mean you're going to burn it. You could just stick it in barrels and keep it there," which I thought was highly entertaining. Look, my view on oil and gas is pretty simple. That we need an evidence-based approach. Is what it says in the SNP manifesto. We need to be looking at the totality of these projects in terms of their climate impact, in terms of our ability to meet net zero, in terms of our ability to provide energy security. And I also think,
Stephen, the Supreme Court is saying no. It's just saying there's no grounds in which this can succeed. You cannot have a climate compatibility test on an oil exploration drilling effort that results in it's okay because the oil will be burnt.
And I think you just said that's relating to a project, and was it Surrey you said?
Surrey.
Yeah, so obviously I want every single application to be going through that evidence-based approach, and I wouldn't seek to prejudge that as a politician. I would just want the grounds.
At the court, they are, and they're basically the Greenpeace have got 3 actions that have been waiting for that Surrey case to be resolved. The Swiss recently got told by another law case inciting international law that there fundamentally is no more drilling that can be successful.
In which case, people should be comforted by the fact that we do want an evidence-based approach to this, because it will allow all the arguments to be put forward in the public domain with regards to whether a project is viable or not. But the big thing for me in all of this, Lesley, and I think it's often forgotten, we love to consume energy. We don't often like to talk about where it comes from, but it comes from the hard work and the ingenuity of the people who work in the sector, the tens of thousands of people, highly skilled people who power our society as it stands. And we need to make sure that all of those people have jobs at the moment, but have jobs in the future, because their success will be our success. And if we want to talk about domestic supply chains for renewables projects, it'll be the people who work in the existing energy sector who will provide that. If we want to talk about decarbonisation, again, it will be those people who will provide that. And then ultimately, if they don't have jobs in the here and the now, they'll do what a vast number of them have already done when the price of oil and gas has dropped, which is they will fly off to Brazil or to Southeast Asia or down to Africa to work on projects there. I mean, I was sitting on a flight the other day back up to Aberdeen with a guy who was on his way back from a fairly significant stint in Africa, way back to Peterhead, because that's where he lives. And it's a transient workforce. So we need to make sure that when we do this evidence-based approach to new licensing, it's something that takes into account our climate responsibilities. But it's also why we need to ramp up our renewables future. And that is where I'm very frustrated with the likely incoming Labour government's position, because not only do they want to bring an end to things, they also have walked away from their £28 billion of green energy commitments. That's the worst of all worlds for Scotland, Scotland's economy, Scottish jobs, but most importantly, our ability to hit net zero.
Right, just some rapid fire questions at the end. There's a wee extra
this
one
worries me.
You.
Don't ask me about Taylor Swift.
No, I would have just completely failed to even come up with a single song. But do you basically want to come back to Holyrood at some point and become leader?
I don't know if I want to come back to Holyrood. If I'm honest, I think I really have a burning desire to elicit change and to make sure that Scotland's independent, if I can play a role in Edinburgh to achieve that, I would like to do so. But my fight right now is making sure I get back in at Westminster and do my best by the people who represent me and by the wider Scottish populace.
I've just got to ask you, do you want to be leader of the SNP?
I'll be honest with you, Leslie, it's not really something that I've given much thought to. I think one of my political heroes is currently in the role. I say heroes. I don't really have many political heroes. That's a wrong term. An icon of the independence movement, let's put it that way, is in the role right now. I'm delighted he is, and you know what? We've got loads of really good folk. Be that Kate, be that Mary, be that Neil. The party's blessed with our next generation of politicians, and I'm confident whoever takes on the reins whenever John decides to call it a day, hopefully not for a good 5-10 years or so, that we'll be well placed to lead the party and lead the nation forward.
Okay, now the football. Okay, that was a terrible match. Has it, do you think, got any impact on the election, how Scotland's done in the Euros, bearing in mind that you pulled England in the national sweepstake?
I'm not sure this is anything new for Scotland to go out in the worst possible manner. The referee done us an absolute kipper last night. Should have given a penalty, but we didn't help ourselves. We should have created more chances, and I'm sure the players will be reflecting on that as well. But I guess the big takeaway for me from the Euros is the fans. I love being a Scotland fan and going to the games. Gutted to miss the last two, obviously, but I know that when I go to the next away games, we'll be having just as much fun, just with a few less telly cameras on us. And yeah, no, I did get the England team in the national sweepstake, which I think was a setup. And I need to make sure that Laura's held to account for this.
Right.
Because,
but do you think that defeat affects people's mood in terms of, you know, how they're going to vote? Do you think there could be a swing away from the independence parties and the SNP because people think, oh God, we can't do anything, we can't win at football, it's always like this?
Nah, I don't think so. And to be honest, on the converse, I think most folk have watched the Scotland team do really well over the course of the last wee while, but also they've watched the support excel. The wee image of the older person on the walking frame with the two Tartan Army walking alongside, shielding from the rain was brilliant, and I see that everywhere I go with the Scotland team. And if anything, I think that could maybe provide a wee bit of added enthusiasm to folks at home.
Right. The Portillo moment that's coming up here. You might be young enough not to remember this, but
I know he's got some dodgy dress sense.
He has got that. But he was also, strangely, since he's kind of become such a kind of hush puppy presenter, he was one of the most hated characters to go, and there was quite a lot of enjoyment from a lot of people watching that moment. It looks like quite a lot of the Tory big beasts are going already. Is there anybody you're particularly looking forward to seeing actually have to stand on the podium and be kicked out?
I haven't thought about that. I wouldn't have shed a tear of Mogg got beat. He's standing again, isn't he? Mogg is standing again. I wouldn't have shed a tear.
Standing,
yeah. I wouldn't have shed a tear if he got beat. But you know what, Leslie, the biggest victory we could see would be Nigel Farage not being successful. His politics of right-wing populism is just disgusting, and I think the greatest joy we could have on election night, aside from a massive victory for the SNP, would be seeing Nigel Farage with a sorry look on his face for the 8th time, and hopefully it's Clacton or something he's standing in. Hopefully the folk who are there can deliver the goods.
So finally, what is your biggest political mistake?
Goodness me. I
haven't made any.
I think. You know what? This isn't even to do with Westminster. See, when I won alongside my colleagues the most SNP councillors ever in 2017, and we were not able to form a council administration because the Labour Party and the Tories teamed up, and that inability to form a coalition, although we don't really have much choice because the two of them teamed up, is something that bugs me massively, because we could have done something transformative for Aberdeen at that time. Thankfully, my colleagues are in control now. A few years later, we managed to break up that coalition, but that's a sore point for me, which goes back a wee bit for sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for all of that, Stephen Flynn, and good luck in the 10 days or whatever it is that remains in this campaign. And I hope it cools down in London for you.
Thank you, Lesley, and I can't wait to go home.